Okay, it's time that I talk about something that I've been putting off for quite a bit because there was a number of other videos that I wanted to get into, but I wanted to talk about why Final Fantasy VII Remake for the Nintendo Switch 2 is one of the most important games for the Nintendo Switch 2 system this generation. In my opinion, there is a plethora of reasons why I think that. Now, I want to make sure that I get this completely correct here. It's Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade. So it's not the base game that launched on the PlayStation 4 back in 2020. It's the upgraded Intergrade version of Final Fantasy VII Remake with the extra content and all of that. So that's going to be awesome. But here's the reason why this game is super important for the Nintendo Switch 2, and I would say for the Final Fantasy franchise going forward. We all know about what happened, and if you don't know what happened, I'm going to break it down first and foremost. So Final Fantasy, when it comes to like the big Final Fantasy games, so Final Fantasy VII Remake, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3, Final Fantasy 16, a number of years ago, there was a deal that Square Enix and Sony struck. They banked on PlayStation being at the top of the game pretty much in all countries, in all regions with Japanese RPGs. And at the time, if you're looking at planning when these games came out, back in 2020, so you're planning years before that, it made sense. The Wii U was cooked. The Wii U was bad. 3DS clearly cannot handle what Final Fantasy is offering. Nintendo's at one of their lowest points overall, and PlayStation has been good to Final Fantasy for a number of decades when it comes down to it. There was nothing to show or indicate too much that could be a fatal flaw based off of the system demographics and what would happen in the future with systems. But the problem was, as time went on, one of the biggest chunks and slices for sales with Final Fantasy, Japan essentially abandoned PlayStation, and PlayStation essentially abandoned Japan in terms of the type of system it was going to have, not following up obviously on the failure of the Vita. There was no follow-up there to make something even bigger and better. And that allowed the Nintendo Switch in 2017 to kind of slide into that spot and essentially take over the reins as the top system from everything else. The 3DS was essentially the best-selling system for that generation in Japan, but obviously the 3DS just couldn't put out what these companies would want in terms of the bigger games. The Nintendo Switch couldn't quite do it either, but there was potential there, what they saw with big games like Dragon Quest XI, in addition to Monster Hunter Rise. So I think that everybody knew at some point Nintendo would get even a further step to where they could get the bigger types of games. Now, how this affected PlayStation and Final Fantasy? Well, because of the Nintendo Switch and the shift to there, Japan completely moved over to the Nintendo Switch for the most part, and software dominated on the Nintendo Switch. So while Final Fantasy VII Remake did good starting out with the PlayStation 4 that had a good install base towards the end of its life, by the time that the PlayStation 5 rolled around, PlayStation 5 was not super popular in Japan, and Nintendo Switch had already taken over by then. So what you got was Final Fantasy VII Rebirth that launched to pretty weak or lower sales in Japan compared to the previous games. And of course, Final Fantasy 16 definitely didn't do as well there. So there was a large chunk of where they usually get big sales from starting out essentially dwindled down in Japan. Now in the West, things dwindled down too. Final Fantasy definitely is not as popular as it used to be. That created issues for the past two Final Fantasy games with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Final Fantasy 16, to where we still don't have updated sales numbers for Rebirth at all, and we haven't gotten any updated numbers for Final Fantasy 16 outside of that first week selling 3 point something million. So they're not talking about that. Now, let's bring it all the way to the pretty much present day at this point. Square Enix has went through a little bit of a crisis overall with Final Fantasy, essentially saying they are done with exclusivity and they are going to move over to more AAA multi-platform development that includes Nintendo consoles, Xbox, PC, and PlayStation, all pretty much day and date. And that's where we're going to hone in and focus in on. It's going to be what? Final Fantasy, this one coming up, Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, and potentially the other games, because we already know, or at least more like it's been rumored by a very credible source that actually got Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade right for the Nintendo Switch 2 with Nate the Hate. He stated that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is also coming, but not Final Fantasy 16. They're focusing on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade. And then it pretty much was hinted at the Final Fantasy project, Final Fantasy VII Remake project, will be coming. So that would be 2 or Rebirth, and also the third game at the Nintendo Switch 2 Direct when the producer talked about Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade coming to the Nintendo Switch. So that's where we are now at this point. The Nintendo Switch 2 is set to be a behemoth in Japan. We're looking at the pre-orders and people snapping up these micro SD express cards and everything. Plus, you look at the prices when it comes down to how everything is in Japan and how Nintendo is able to get that lower. It is going to be a nice, smooth transition from the Nintendo Switch 1 to the Nintendo Switch 2, and Square Enix is absolutely banking on that for people to say, okay, renewed interest in Final Fantasy, big chunk of sales in the homeland with Japan, and then of course they can also get auxiliary sales with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth when that finally does come out for the Nintendo Switch 2, and then kind of put everything to a head, which I'm not sure if it will be day and date because I think Square Enix and Sony still have an exclusivity deal, at least timed exclusivity deal, with all of the Final Fantasy VII Remake project games. But I do think in due time it will come to everything. So I think that with Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, this is the opportunity to show for the next major Final Fantasy that the Nintendo Switch 2 is going to be a viable platform for sales and for the game overall. They like to go big when it comes to Final Fantasy. They like to make sure that they show flashy graphics and everything like that. But I do think that the next major Final Fantasy game is going to strike more of a balance of creating a great game overall that looks good, but then also has the gameplay elements that get people excited, not only in the West, but also in Japan with ATB combat, with more turn-based type of elements. I do think that they are going to consider that. But before we continue, you guys should all consider subscribing to the channel if you're not already subscribed. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and click that notification bell to get my vids as soon as they drop. So I do feel that this is going to be one of the biggest games when it comes to third-party titles. There are a number of big titles coming up for the Nintendo Switch 2. I don't think a lot of those are as consequential. Most of the audience is probably going to be on PlayStation, Xbox, PC, have already bought some of these games. But I do feel that games coming up, the big Japanese titles that are looking to expand and not really have historically been mainline on Nintendo right there day and date, they're going to be looking at the sales numbers and seeing what they can do to adjust. They're going to be looking at how the Nintendo Switch 2 launches in Japan. I think it's going to be a big launch sales-wise. A lot of them were not on the board with the Nintendo Switch 1 when it launched because of the Wii U flopping and the 3DS just not starting out strong. That completely changed in terms of their mindsets. If you look at what's happening with the Nintendo Switch 2, the amount of Japanese games that we already have announced, the amount of developers that are putting out games for this system. We got launch games from Japan, from Europe, from the US. We got all sorts of stuff for Switch 2. So developers absolutely learned their lesson from that one, because the Nintendo Switch 1 just launched with The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and no other major Japanese AAA games or even Western AAA games at all. It was all independent, AA type of titles, and Breath of the Wild is the only big AAA game. So that's clearly a change here from like Street Fighter, Bravely Default, and Cyberpunk, and Split Fiction, and Hitman, and Yakuza, and all these different games that are coming to the Nintendo Switch 2 at launch, and of course ones that have been announced for later, like Borderlands, for example. Borderlands 4, that's pretty big day and date when it comes down to it. So I do feel that this is going to be one of the most important games with Final Fantasy VII Remake, how it does on the Nintendo Switch 2, and Square Enix is going to be watching very closely. So I'm hoping they do this game right. And how can they do this game right? Do not put it on a game key card. Please, Square Enix. I think it'll still sell decently enough, but put it on a 64GB cartridge if you can. Put it on there, get it on a full physical with the box art and everything. But we'll have to wait and see. I'm going to get the game regardless because I do think it's incredibly important, but I'm just looking forward to seeing how Square Enix is going to handle all of this, and of course how fans are going to react to the game. Now, let's get into the next thing here, because there is something that I'm pretty sure would shock all of you guys when it comes to the Nintendo Switch 2. Guess what type of game is coming? Guess what Nintendo is working on? I'm going to tell you guys real quick, okay? Listen up. Nintendo says stay tuned for a new Mario game. I mean, oh my goodness, I know. Mind's blown. Nintendo working on a new Mario game? Yes, that does seem to be the case here. So let's talk about this article, because I found this to be pretty interesting and more kind of like funny, because it's like, yeah, Nintendo, it's the house that Mario built. So Nintendo on a new Mario game for Nintendo Switch 2, they say, quote, stay tuned. So some people were a little bit surprised that we didn't get a big 3D Mario game at the Nintendo Switch 2 Direct or shown off. Clearly, Mario has been one of the big staples, and obviously a game like Mario Odyssey sold millions upon millions. I think 30 million copies plus or something like that. Something crazy, right? We haven't had anything since 2017 when it comes to a brand new big Mario game, with the closest thing being a side story with Bowser's Fury with the Super Mario 3D World. So when it comes down to it, CNET asks Nintendo of America President Doug Bowser, what is going on with Mario? And he said this, quote, "Stay tuned. You know, we have a long catalog and a long list of intellectual property that I'm sure will make its way to the platform." So that's what pretty much this is, guys. Now, there's been some talk of the Donkey Kong Bonanza team actually being the 3D Mario team, so that could actually explain why one is first. But here's my theory on that. I think that that big time that they took, they knew that Super Mario Odyssey would be selling for the whole generation on the Nintendo Switch. It was selling gangbusters, so there was really no need to make a Super Mario Odyssey 2 or to make anything else. I think the Super Mario Odyssey team took that time, that 8+ years, to create 2 games for the Nintendo Switch 2. Donkey Kong Bonanza, in addition to a brand new big 3D Mario game, splitting it up essentially into 2 parts, pretty much one 4-year and then like another 4-year plus or so. So they did Donkey Kong Bonanza first, potentially looking at if that's going to be a Switch game or a Switch 2 game. They decided, okay, let's go Switch 2, let's develop that. So they've been working on that since 2017, 2018. I think they finished up that game, got it ready, probably could have been a launch title, and they said, okay, let's work on the next 3D Mario game after that. Now, that's just my theory when it comes down to it, but I do think that it's a good theory overall when it comes down to it. I think that they worked on both and they added people in and out on the projects based on what they needed for each of the games. Nintendo added a ton of staff and everything, and you bet that a lot of them went to that Mario team. So that's what I think actually happened here. So we'll see what happens over here, man. I think it's going to be very interesting. Nintendo with Doug Bowser saying that they got a long library of games, and I think that Nintendo took the long generation to truly really just say, okay, let's get everything that we need to get out on the Nintendo Switch, but let's also build for the future with a ton of games. And we're seeing that in the first 6 months of the Nintendo Switch 2. There's like 5 or 6 first-party games that they're releasing on the system, smaller titles and actually new big titles outside of like the Nintendo Switch 2 editions of older stuff like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom and Kirby and the Forgotten Land. So very good stuff overall. I'm excited to see what this next big 3D Mario game can hold for us. And I'm probably going to do another video kind of focused on Donkey Kong Bonanza and 3D Mario, because I want to talk about those 2 games in particular and how things can kind of intertwine. So maybe we'll talk about that in the future. All right, for the last topic here, guys, I love this. Nintendo has done something that I don't think they've done. They actually went back 30+ years, and it just hits me right in the nostalgia, because I remember watching this commercial back in the day. Paul Rudd. I didn't know he was Paul Rudd back then. I just knew him as a dude, the long hair and like the blazer and all that. So Nintendo has went back in time and revived Paul Rudd for a Nintendo Switch 2 commercial. Now you're playing with power, super power. So here's what I'm going to do for all my people that don't know what's going on here. I'm going to play the original Super Nintendo commercial, and then we'll check out the new commercial. So check this out, guys.
When you decide to step up to this kind of power, this kind of challenge, this kind of flying, crashing, feeling, when you decide to get serious, there's only one place to come: the games of Super Nintendo. No one else creates this kind of experience, because no one else creates these kinds of games. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
Yeah, that was pretty cool, right? Now you're seeing the new commercial kind of lined up right next to it. And I love what they did here. It's a throwback. It's been 30+ years in the making to see Paul Rudd come back in this type of way. I'm not sure if Paul Rudd has done anything else with Nintendo, but even if he has or hasn't, this was absolutely perfect. And I'm not saying this is the best commercial that Nintendo's ever done or better than the Switch 1 commercials, but for us that grew up with the Super Nintendo and Nintendo actually almost calling the Nintendo Switch 2 the Super Nintendo Switch, I think that this makes perfect sense overall. It's a great commercial. It's a lot of fun seeing Paul Rudd, and it appears like that's actually his real life family, or at least some of them are his real life family, because one of them says, "Hi, Uncle Paul." So I'm guessing that's actually his niece or something like that. But either way, even if it's not, it's just cool. And I like what they're showing. They're kind of advertising the feature of being able to play together. One of the biggest problems and one of the biggest criticisms of the Nintendo Switch 1 was no voice chat, no community type of things to get together and play, no party chat. And now they're advertising that front and center with the feature that I think other systems don't have. They have party chat, but they don't have like the video chat integrated with the games normally. It's just party chat with voice. So I think that's a pretty cool thing to show off. And of course, it's a family type of system. It's also for gamers. They show off Mario Kart. That's one of the best games. It's going to be a launch title. So I think that this is going to be a great launch, man. I cannot wait for this. So what do you guys think about Paul Rudd coming back with superpower with the Nintendo Switch 2 in addition to Mario and Donkey Kong? What's going on there? And of course, Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade being one of the most important Nintendo Switch 2 games. Let me know in the comment section below. All right, guys, that wraps it up for this video here. Thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it. Please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're someone new, click that notification bell, and check out my other Nintendo Switch 2 RPG content and more right here on screen. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you guys for the next one. Peace.